Okay, in this last of the slide videos, I'm going to discuss some derived rules, and I'm going to talk about strategy or basic strategy for Chapter 3 derivations. So just to remind you, we have three new primitive rules. We have universal instantiation. If you have the universal, you can infer any instance of it you like. If you have an existential, you can infer any instance. Well, you can infer an instance of it if the instance involves a variable entirely new to the derivation that shows up nowhere else earlier in the derivation. And we have existential generalization, which says if you have an instance of an existential generalization, you can infer the existential generalization. And those are called UI, EI, and EG. And they have binding restrictions that we've discussed a little bit. Now, we also have a new method of derivation, like direct derivation or conditional derivation. Or in direct derivation, we have a method called universal derivation, and it lets us show universally quantified sentences that begin with a universal quantifier. We're not going to worry about that right now. We'll talk about it and get into its use in the next session or so. There's some important derived rules called quantifier negation rules, or QN. They're fundamentally important rules. Now they're derived, but so here they are. Remember, we have talked about the equivalence of different negations and quantifiers. So we have, if it's not the case that everything is F, you can infer something is not F. And if something is not F, then it's not the case that everything is F. And if it's not the case that something is F, then everything is not F. And if everything is not F, then it's not the case that something is F. Note what's happening each of these is just this. When the negation moves across a quantifier in either direction, either in or out, it just flips the quantifier. So if you're outside of one and you move across, it turns into the other. If you're inside of one and you pull it out, it turns into the other again. So and these are in a way analogs of De Morgan's for quantifiers. In fact, if you think of the universal as a big and the existential as a big or, then that's exactly what they are. So, yeah, if you look back at the quantifier negation slide, then you'll see this. So, to enable these rules, you have to derive certain theorems, and in this case, it's theorems 203 and 204. However, for right now, the Q1 there's a caveat to this, which is that QN is enabled by default for 3.1 through 3.18. So to use QN on those, you don't have to derive theorems 203 and 204. You can just go ahead and use them without having done anything else. Once you get beyond theorem 18, at that point you'll need to derive theorems 203 and 204. And the reason we're doing it this way is because our basic derivation strategy uses the QN rules, and then we'll get a more sophisticated strategy that, while using them, doesn't rely on them as heavily. But for now, we're going to have a strategy that does rely on them. So for our first derivations, our rules are the three primitive rules: universal instantiation, existential instantiation, and existential generalization, and then these four QN rules. So you're going to be using all of these basically in the first through 3.18. So the basic strategy is like this. You focus on UI and EI, and you use the derived QN rules. And so you're not going to worry so much about UD or EG. If you see opportunities for EG, fine. If you figure out how UD works on your own and see an opportunity to use it, great. But don't worry about them. And then later, we'll derive QN using UD and EG and see other ways in which it's useful to use universal derivation and existential generalization. But right now, focus is UI and EI and the derived and the already enabled QN rules. So the setup is like this. You're going to be showing a universal, some sort of quantified. You'll end up with whenever you have a quantified sentence in your show line, then you'll make an indirect assumption, whether it's a universal or existential that you're trying to show, and then you'll apply the QN rule, and that will let you. So note that with 2, can you apply UI with 2? No, because it's not a universal derivation. It's the negation of it's not a universal generalization. It's the negation of a universal generalization. So UI doesn't work with it. And similarly, you can't apply en to 2. But if you apply qn to these things, then they turn into things that you can use the UI rules with. And this is just like in chapters 1 and 2, where if you had something negated, you needed to deal with the negation to turn it into something that you could use, like DM using the De Morgan's rules, or NC or NB. So here at line 3, you can EI in the first one, and in the second one, you can UI. And that's why we do this strategy. We make the indirect assumption, apply qn, and then we can get you can use our UI and EI rules. So the first thing you're going to do is make an indirect assumption, and then you apply the appropriate form of qn. And this is, so that's the sort of the new setup of the sort of overall derivation. And then the first thing you want to do after having done all that is EI with each existential quantifier. And then after having done that, UI each universal quantifier. And you may UI each universal quantifier to more than one thing. So you might apply UI to the same line more than once. So if you have a universal quantifier and you say did EI to a variable, then you'll do UI to that variable. If you did EI to two variables, then with your one universal quantifier, you'll UI to each of those two variables. And if there are names that show up in the derivation, then you also UI to them. So you may apply UI to a given line a bunch of times. But so the first thing you do is you do the indirect assumption in qn, and then you do this EI UI thing. And then after that, once you're done with that, you'll find a contradiction with what you've got. You'll have a bunch of sentences that you get from EI and UI, and those sentences will have no quantifiers in them, and then you'll be able to use chapter 1 and 2 rules to get a contradiction. Now, there are two things here that you won't always be able to sort of follow these suggestions absolutely, but to the extent that you can, you want to. The first is you do chapter 3, and so qn, UI, EI, before you do any chapter 2 material, and you EI before you UI, always. And we'll see why that is in one of the last 2 videos. I'm going to do some rule recognition problems in one video, and then some derivations in another. And you have to EI before you UI. This is fundamental and critical. So if you do it the other way around, you'll end up with variables that don't match, and you won't be able to apply your chapter 1 and 2 rules. We'll see this, but EI before UI all the time, whenever possible. So this is the basic strategy, and it will work. It will get us through our derivations 318, and then we'll expand our strategy a little bit. And so I'm going to do a rule recognition video, and then there will also be a derivation examples video that I think you'll find really helpful, because we haven't done any sample derivations and we haven't applied these strategies. And if you could go and try them and apply them to derivations just off the bat, but I think you'll find it really helpful to see some derivations done following these strategies. So I hope these have been helpful. If you have questions, shoot me an email or come see me in office hours on Thursday.